All right, so today we're diving into ancient India. Yeah, we're going to explore the life and teachings of the Buddha. And where else would we go for this but straight to the source, the Pali Canon?
It's sometimes called the Bible of Buddhism.
Right. But, and here's what I'm really curious about, how do we take this historical figure, the Buddha, and reconcile that with how he's shown in the scriptures, larger than life, almost mythical at times?
It's a fascinating question, and honestly one that scholars and practitioners have been wrestling with for centuries, because the Pali Canon isn't just a biography, it's this whole tapestry of discourses, stories, rules for the monastic life, all woven together to get at the essence of what the Buddha was teaching.
So we're talking history, but we're also talking legend, spiritual teaching. It's a blend.
Precisely. And I think that's what makes it so compelling. But we're going to dive in. Let's start at the beginning. Siddhartha Gautama, the man who would become the Buddha. We often hear about the prince living in the lap of luxury.
Oh, yeah, like some kind of Aladdin story, but with a deeper meaning.
Right? Exactly. But the texts, and this is where it gets interesting, they tell us Siddhartha was troubled. He saw suffering inside the palace walls, outside the palace walls, and he realized that even a life full of pleasure, it wasn't immune. Sickness, aging, death, it all still happened.
So much for the fairy tale life, huh? It wasn't like a chariot race could fix this. What did he do?
Imagine the societal norms he was challenging when he chose to renounce it all, his princely life. The texts describe his parents, devastated, heartbroken. But Siddhartha, he was on a mission. He wanted a permanent solution to this universal problem, suffering. And that wasn't just some side project for him. This was everything.
And that search, that led him to some pretty intense practices. I mean, we're talking 6 years of hardcore asceticism. What was he even doing?
We're talking extreme fasting, to the point where the texts describe him as emaciated, like a withered leaf. And the Pali Canon doesn't shy away from the details of this. It really paints a picture of a man pushing himself to the absolute limit, mind and body.
Talk about dedication.
Yeah.
But even after all that, he still hadn't found what he was searching for.
And that's where things get really interesting, because it was a turning point for him. He realized punishing his body wasn't the answer. That experience actually led him to what he'd later call the second noble truth. That even clinging to this extreme way of life, that's the root of suffering. True liberation, he realized, wouldn't come from physical hardship, but from mental discipline, wisdom.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not about what you're doing externally, it's what's happening internally.
Precisely. He understood that we create our own suffering by clinging to desires, to things that are impermanent, to this idea of a separate self, which he would later articulate as the first and third noble truths, that suffering exists and that there's a way to end it.
So he's done with the extreme asceticism, and he decides to meditate under a fig tree. A Bodhi tree, which later becomes a pretty major symbol in Buddhism, right?
It did. The Bodhi tree came to represent that potential for enlightenment that exists within each of us. And for Siddhartha, it was under this tree that he challenged and ultimately transcended those final layers of ego. He achieved enlightenment. He became the Buddha, the awakened one.
That is an incredible story. But one thing I keep coming back to are those dreams he had right before his enlightenment. 5 significant dreams, the texts say. What's the significance?
The dreams. These weren't just random images. They were full of symbolism. In one, he sees his body encompassing the entire world, his head resting on the Himalayas.
Okay, but what does that even mean? Like, what's the deeper meaning there?
It symbolized the expansive nature of the enlightenment he was about to realize. Another dream, it depicted a creeper sprouting from his navel and reaching for the heavens, foreshadowing his discovery of the Noble Eightfold Path.
It's fascinating how these ancient texts take these very symbolic images and weave them into the events of his life.
And they give us a roadmap, a way to understand how to alleviate our own suffering by following the path the Buddha himself walked.
So he's reached enlightenment, he's the Buddha, he's had these incredibly vivid dreams about what it all means. What happens next? Does he shout it from the mountaintops, write a book?
Well, remember those 5 ascetics, the ones he'd practiced with before his enlightenment? They became his first students.
Oh, right.
Initially, they were skeptical, but they quickly saw the transformation in him, the wisdom in his teaching.
It makes sense. I mean, they knew what he'd been through, right? They were there for the before picture.
Exactly. And that moment marked the beginning of the Sangha, the Buddhist monastic community. It was all about studying, practicing, and preserving his teachings, the Dhamma.
Okay, so we've got the Four Noble Truths, that's the why of his teachings. We've got the Sangha, the who, but what about the what? What is this Dhamma?
People translate it as the teachings, but it's more than just words on a page. It's about the truth of reality as the Buddha experienced it. It's the path to liberation, the ethical principles. It's all woven through with concepts like anicca, impermanence, dukkha, suffering, and anatta, the idea of non-self.
Okay, so we're not talking about a quick self-help seminar here. This is deep stuff.
No, this was about a radical shift in perspective. And the Buddha, he didn't limit his audience. Kings, queens, merchants, farmers, anyone who would listen, he spoke to.
It wasn't some exclusive club.
Yeah.
I like that. And I guess that included family, too, because he goes back to visit his father, right? King Suddhodana. Talk about an interesting family reunion. I mean, his dad was devastated when he left to become an ascetic.
Absolutely. The Pali Canon really captures King Suddhodana's emotions, totally overwhelmed. Imagine seeing your son, not as a prince, but as an enlightened being after all those years. And during that visit, the king hears his son teach for the first time, and the Dhamma, it just resonates so deeply that he reaches this high level of spiritual understanding.
Yeah, that is a father-son bonding experience.
It doesn't stop there. Siddhartha's cousin, Ananda, he joins the Sangha, eventually becoming like the Buddha's right-hand man, the one who memorized and preserved tons of these teachings.
Like a walking, talking Pali Canon.
Exactly. And even Siddhartha's own son, Rahula, he joins the Sangha too.
Wow, the whole family.
And in the Pali Canon, we get these amazing teachings specifically for Rahula, like about honesty, mindfulness, ethical conduct, timeless wisdom, even thousands of years later. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, even for the Buddha.
Right, because every good story needs a little conflict, even in the spiritual world.
Exactly, because despite the purity of these teachings, there were disagreements, challenges, even from within the Sangha itself.
Oh no, really?
Yeah. Take Devadatta, for example, initially a disciple, and get this, the Buddha's own cousin.
No way.
Oh, yeah. But he got consumed by ambition, trying to usurp the Buddha's leadership, and get this, he even tries to murder him.
Whoa. Murder. At least challenge him to a chariot race.
Right. No chariot races, unfortunately. The Pali Canon describes how Devadatta actually hired archers to ambush the Buddha. Thankfully, the Buddha knew what Devadatta was up to, remained unharmed. But it goes even deeper than that. Devadatta, he actually tried to change the Sangha from within, pushing for way stricter rules, almost like he wanted to make Buddhism even more hardcore.
So it wasn't just a power grab. He had a different vision for what Buddhism should be.
Exactly. Devadatta believed that austerity, rigidity, that was the path to respect and influence. But the Buddha rejected his proposals. He had already learned during his own time as an ascetic that true liberation, it doesn't come from punishing the body.
Fascinating.
And this clash of ideology, this difference in how to walk the path, it ultimately led to Devadatta breaking away from the Sangha, starting his own following.
It really gets you thinking about how even the most profound teachings, they can be interpreted in such different ways.
Yeah.
And the very human dramas that can play out, even within spiritual communities.
Absolutely. And it underscores that this journey to enlightenment, to embodying the Dhamma, it's deeply personal, full of challenges, full of different interpretations. And speaking of interpretations, the establishment of the Order of Nuns, that stirred up its own share of controversy too.
Oh, right. With the Buddha's aunt, Mahapajapati Gotami. She raised him. I can only imagine trying to join the Sangha as a woman back in ancient India. That had to be a big deal.
Revolutionary is more like it. Initially, the Buddha hesitated. He was very aware of the societal norms, the potential challenges, but eventually he agreed, but with conditions. Mahapajapati Gotami and all future nuns, they had to follow the 8 Garudhammas.
Garudhammas. What are those?
They were a set of rules that, honestly, from a modern perspective, they seem to place nuns in a subordinate position to monks.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, for one, there's a rule stating that even a nun, even if she'd been ordained for 100 years, she still had to bow to a monk, even one ordained only a day.
Wow.
These rules, they're still debated today, Some scholars suggest they were a necessary compromise, a way to establish the order of nuns in that patriarchal society. Others see them as evidence of this inherent bias within the teachings themselves.
It really makes you think about how even enlightened beings are still operating within a certain cultural context, and how interpreting these ancient teachings, it takes some real careful consideration.
Yeah, it's a conversation that continues to this day. But going back to the Buddha's journey, the Pali Canon also gives us this really detailed account of his final days, this time when he's preparing his followers for his passing.
Which, given his teachings about impermanence, that must have been, particularly poignant. How did he guide his followers through that?
Well, the Pali Canon, It describes the Buddha, around 80 years old, still teaching, traveling after decades of this. He understood everything is impermanent, even a Buddha's life. And during his final journey, he keeps emphasizing non-attachment, mindfulness, facing life's changes with grace and awareness.
Walking the walk right to the very end. So how did it happen? His death, or parinirvana, as it's called in Buddhism.
The texts say he became ill. It was after a meal offered by a blacksmith, Kunda. And while what exactly caused it is debated, some people speculate food poisoning, others, a natural illness. What's clear is how the Buddha faced it.
I bet this is where we really see the depth of his teaching.
Absolutely. Because the Pali Canon describes him as being calm, composed, even in his final moments, still teaching, comforting his disciples, reminding them, impermanence, it's a fundamental truth. Even a Buddha's physical form, it fades away eventually.
What a powerful lesson in acceptance. So after his parinirvana, what happened to the teachings? How did they survive?
Well, his followers were devastated, understandably. But they knew these teachings, they had to be preserved. And that's where we get the first Buddhist council, this gathering of 500 senior monks. Their mission, make sure the Dhamma, the Sangha, they continue on, even without the Buddha there in person.
So they were like the first guardians of these teachings.
Exactly. Imagine them meticulously memorizing, reciting these discourses, making sure they got it right as they pass them on to future generations. And that's where the Pali Canon, this text we've been exploring, it really starts to take shape.
From those early efforts to preserve his words to what we have today, still studied, still debated, that's remarkable. But we've talked a lot about deeper meanings, interpretations. What about some of the, more intriguing stories in the Pali Canon? I gotta say, I was fascinated by that account of the Buddha and the fire-breathing serpent, the Naga.
Yes, the Naga story, a classic. Pure Pali Canon symbolism there. We have the Buddha meditating in a forest, and he's confronted by this fierce mythical creature, spewing fire, venom, the whole 9 yards.
Sounds more like an action movie than a spiritual text. So how did he handle that? Was there a chariot involved?
No chariots this time. The text says he subdued this Naga not with physical force, but with his own mental fire, the power of his compassion, his wisdom.
Okay, that's even more impressive than a chariot, but what does it mean? What's the deeper message?
It's this really potent image, right? It's highlighting that sometimes the most effective way to overcome conflict, internal or external, isn't through force, but through understanding, through compassion. The Buddha's showing us that by mastering our own minds, even the most, fearsome demons, they can be pacified.
It's a great metaphor for our own internal struggles, too. Speaking of powerful figures, what about Visakha? She was this wealthy laywoman who became a devoted follower. What's so interesting about her story?
Visakha was amazing, intelligent, generous, and so committed to supporting the Sangha. The Pali Canon tells us how she goes to the Buddha, and she requests these 8 specific boons, basically permissions that would allow her to help the Sangha in really significant ways.
Like what kind of boons we're talking about?
Practical stuff, but important. Like she wanted to provide robes for them during the rainy season, food for visiting monks, medicine for the sick. She was really looking out for their needs, recognizing what the community really needed to function.
Wow. And he granted her these boons.
He did. He saw her devotion was genuine, and how crucial it was to have lay people involved supporting the Dhamma. Visakha's story shows us that the path to enlightenment, as laid out in the Dhamma, it wasn't just for the monks, it was open to everyone.
Really drives home the inclusiveness of the Buddha's teachings. But it wasn't like everyone he came across started out as a devoted follower, right? Take Angulimala, for example. Now, he was a bandit, a murderer, terrorized people. What happened when Ichi met the Buddha?
Angulimala's story, now that is a story of transformation, redemption, one of the most dramatic in the Pali Canon, probably. Imagine the Buddha walking through the forest, and he runs into this hardened criminal, armed, dangerous, ready to do some serious harm.
Okay, I am getting chills. What did the Buddha do?
Instead of fear, confrontation, the Buddha, he just calmly speaks to Angulimala, prompts him to really think about his actions, the weight of them. He appealed to that part of Angulimala that even after years of violence, there was still good in him.
And it worked. Seriously.
The Pali Canon describes how the Buddha's words, they just cut right through. Angulimala, he's hit with remorse, realizing what he'd done, the magnitude of it. He gives up his violent past, asks the Buddha to be his teacher, embarks on a whole new path, one of peace, compassion.
It reminds us that change, it's always possible. That everyone, no matter how lost, they have the potential for good within them.
It's the transformative power of compassion. The Buddha's unwavering belief in redemption.
Wow. This entire deep dive has been, eye-opening. From the historical context to unpacking those really profound, sometimes puzzling stories, we've learned so much about the Dhamma, the Sangha, and just how much power these teachings still hold.
And haven't we come full circle? Right back to that question you asked at the beginning. How do we reconcile the historical Buddha with this, I don't know, almost mythologized version of him?
We have, and maybe that's the point. The Pali Canon, it's not just a historical account. It gives us this framework for understanding, a path for exploring our own potential for growth, for awakening. Look beyond the surface, the historical details, and discover that truth for ourselves.
And isn't that the core of the message? It's not about blind faith. It's about cultivating wisdom, compassion, mindfulness in our own lives.
It's about walking our own path, just like Siddhartha did, and like he taught so many others to do, no matter who they were, where they came from.
It's a journey we can all take. We've got the wisdom of these ancient texts, the example of a man who walked his talk, inviting us to do the same.
Beautifully said. And that is all the time we have for today's deep dive. But we'll leave you with this. Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking. Until next time, keep learning, growing, and diving deep into this world of knowledge.